It's my pleasure to welcome Meredith Niles to the Mitchell Center today. I will say that Tim Waring, who is hosting her visit, really wanted to do this, but he's actually having to teach right now, so he's pretty bummed out about that, but I was delighted. One of the things that I enjoyed learning about Meredith and her family are their deep roots in Maine, going back to, at least the 1820s or so, still up in the Holton area. And some of them I think are here. It would be too embarrassing to have you raise your hands. Great, welcome, it's nice to have you. The Mitchell Center, you've probably heard the name George Mitchell before, is really meant to channel, I think, Senator Mitchell's commitment to working with lots of different people to solve real important problems in Maine and beyond. And Senator Mitchell was here last week, so that was a great honor for all of us. A pretty fascinating background, and honestly someone who we would love to be able to work with here. So one goal of this visit is for us to explore potential collaborations across Vermont and Maine. But Meredith's background is that she has a degree in political science as well as an honors in environmental studies from the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. And then she went to a university that you sometimes hear about, UC Davis. I say that with a goofy look on my face because I also did my PhD at Davis, where she was in the Department of Environmental Science and Policy. I should know that.
I'm in that department too.
I was. What building are they in?
Wixon.
Still in Wixon. Are there still like graffiti from?
It hasn't changed.
Yeah, wonderful. Where she had a lot of wonderful support, including she was part of an IGERT at and National Science Foundation Interdisciplinary Graduate Education and Research Traineeship to get rid of the jargon, as well as her own Graduate Research Fellowship and a Switzer Foundation Fellow. So a lot of great recognition for work that you'll see kind of her focus on this intersection of climate change and agriculture and where adaptation fits into that. Not surprisingly, she went on from there to do good things. She first went to a place we know well, Harvard Sustainability Science Program, the one that Bill Clark is the co-director of, and you may know Nancy Dixon was also on our advisory board here. So she worked at the Kennedy School as one of the Sustainability Science Research Fellows. And then she's now a brand new assistant professor at the University of Vermont in the Department of Nutrition and Food Sciences, and as part of this really exciting food systems initiative that they're developing there, which we all ought to find out more about so we can copy them for whatever we haven't figured out yet. So I think at that point I will turn it over to Meredith and let her fly.
Great, thank you.
Just see though if we can. Where are you down? Oh, so you're ready to go, right?
Yeah. All right.
Okay.
Great. Thank you.
Sit in your seat.
Please. Well, thank you so much for the nice introduction. As David mentioned, my family is deeply rooted in Maine, so it's important, especially for me, to be at the University of Maine, given long family roots here, and I was up in Holton for the weekend. So I'm really excited to be here and thinking a little bit more about focusing increasingly in the New England area around some of my work on climate change and agriculture. So thank you for having me, and to Tim and to everyone for hosting me. Look forward to the talk tomorrow as well. I'll be around for that, and encourage you all to go to that as well. I think it's a great little 2-day thing they're doing around climate change and agriculture to think more deeply about that at University of Maine. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about some work, a multi-year project I've been doing for the last 4 or 5 years actually, and it's focused in California and New Zealand, but I'm hoping there's some implications for Maine and the New England area as well, and look forward to talking through some of that in the discussion. So just to ground the talk a little bit in this context, I'm a little shorter than David. Agriculture is both a contributor to and a potential victim of climate change. And so by that I mean that agriculture contributes greenhouse gas emissions. The largest source of non-CO2 emissions is agriculture globally. So those are nitrous oxide and methane emissions from cattle and nitrogen fertilizers. And if you look at the whole food system globally, we're actually talking about estimates say between 19 and 29% of all greenhouse gas emissions globally coming from the associated food systems processes. Now that's transportation and distribution and processing, not just what's happening at the farm level, but importantly, a major contribution to climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. The other side of that for climate change and for agriculture is that it's also a potential victim of what we know might happen in the future. So extreme events that may become more frequent. And some work is suggesting that up to 40% of the Earth's land surface may develop novel climates, which has huge implications for how we grow crops, how we think about water and food productivity and agricultural productivity. So that's an important thing to frame and understand as we start to think about, well, how do farmers respond to both of those mitigation and adaptation components. And this, of course, is on top of all of these other global challenges that we hear a lot about. Feeding the world, that statistic gets thrown around a lot, that we have to produce 70% more food by 2050. There's reasons that that could be controversial, but in general, people are also thinking about this in the context of climate change. So not only thinking about a growing population, but then if we're losing potential productivity and land, how do we do that? And how do we do that also as diets are changing? And we know that there's a projected increase in demand for meat and milk and dairy products, particularly from the developing world, which, for example, in South Asia is expected to have an increase of 309% of meat demand from 2005 to 2050. So in that context, what's especially interesting when we look at this country is that, despite some of these challenges that we know we're facing, and despite the fact that there's a lot of science coming out about climate change, we're actually holding pretty steady in terms of what people think about climate change. So this is from a Gallup poll that's conducted every year. They ask a number of questions about climate change. And what you may notice is that it was 39% of people who were concerned believers in climate change in 2001, and the exact same number of people, percentage-wise, in 2014. So 39%, pretty steady over a 13-year time period, when information about climate change became increasingly available. The IPCC reports became more available. People started to talk about it more. Especially with an inconvenient truth, you see a little bit of a bump, but you also see a subsequent rise in the deniers as a result of an inconvenient truth, and that whole time frame around 2007 as well. So this kind of presents itself as a question. Is it that the public just doesn't understand climate change? Is this a knowledge issue? Is this an issue about the fact that we just don't have enough climate science out there? And climate scientists have talked about this, and some sort of keep saying this is a problem. But I really like this cartoon because I think it, as the caption says, sums up some of the frustrations that people have about communicating climate change. So, 1990, the IPCC sort of says, this could be a problem, and then 5 years later, it's definitely a problem. 2001, we should probably do something about this. 2007, all right, starting to sound like a broken record, and into the future going like, hello, is this on? Or are people even listening to us? And so there's been this idea that, well, the public just doesn't understand climate change, and that's why we haven't seen action on it, and maybe that's why we haven't seen behavior change or policy change. But what I'm here to argue today, actually, through a lot of my own work, is that's not actually necessarily the whole story. And in part because it turns out that actually just having more education doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to acknowledge the role of climate change. So this is from the director of the Yale Climate Project earlier this year, and there's 2 studies that came out that I think are really interesting that demonstrate that political ideology is also an important component of some of these issues, which starts to get at some of the more complex socio-political, economic, and cultural values that might influence people's drivers of belief in climate change. So this study basically looked at probability to believe that the climate was changing and that humans caused it, and their degree of college education, formal education, and they found that no matter the education, if you're a Republican, that you're less likely to believe in climate change. If you're a Democrat, you're more likely, and with an independent, kind of similar as well, not necessarily increasing education and knowledge drives behavior change. So that kind of lends itself to, well, what does? What are the things that might influence people's perceptions of this phenomenon? And I'm mostly here to argue that this is a little bit more about perceptions and other sociocultural factors. So these are 3 recent studies that I think start to get at some of this a little bit differently. This is a picture I actually took a couple weeks ago. I was checking out at the grocery store, and the USA Today was reporting on the South Carolina floods using the term biblical flooding, which I thought was really interesting, and I had never seen that reported that way before. But I thought, well, that's a really interesting way to communicate to potentially a different audience of people who haven't necessarily thought about these more extreme events. This article is really interesting. Sid Miller is the Secretary of Agriculture in Texas, and this is just 2 days old. And he recently came out and said he finally has decided that humans play a role in climate change. And that's pretty major in and of itself. But the reason, anybody know? Don't read, guess. Why did Sid Miller suddenly decide that climate change is a problem? He went to China. That's what he said. He said, I went to China and I started to see the pollution in China, and I suddenly realized after experiencing that level of pollution, we're probably doing something to the environment, and we're probably having an impact. So it was his experience with something that changed his opinion. It wasn't reading another IPCC report. It wasn't listening to a government agency tell him about it. It was his experience with it. So that is really going to be the focus of my talk today. And this is a quote, actually, I heard at a conference that Tim and I were at together back in May. And the person told me that Einstein is the quote. But I tried to Google it, and Google didn't confirm that. So now I just say it's unknown. But facts are just facts, and perception is reality. And so this is a study about perceptions. And I'm going to tell you about the work that I've done the past couple years in California and New Zealand with farmers. So in general, the 3 research questions that I've been looking at, in part because I really see farmers at the core of any strategy to deal with climate change, is how have they experienced climate change, and how does that influence their perceptions and perceived risks and potential responses? How does scale affect the way that they think about behaviors and strategies differently? And then what influences their potential to adopt practices for mitigation and adaptation and support climate change policies? So those are the 3 things I'm going to focus on today, and tell you this story about perceptions and behavior. And I did this through a global comparative mixed methods approach that I'll tell you a little bit about. So I focused in Yolo County, California, which is conveniently where UC Davis is, so that was helpful. And also in 2 regions in New Zealand. So anybody been to New Zealand in the room? Okay, we got a couple. Great. So Hawke's Bay and Marlborough. So Hawke's Bay is this North Island Regional Council area, and Marlborough is down south. Now, anyone that's been to New Zealand may accuse me of doing all of my research in the wine regions, which is entirely true. Those are the 2 wine grape growing regions in New Zealand, and I actually work a lot with wine grape growers, and they're actually an interesting group to work with around climate change because temperature is a huge issue for wine grapes. So it was not entirely convenient, as I will explain. There was a reason for these areas. But overall, we did both interviews with farmers and agricultural policy people and industry in these regions, as well as a survey. So all total, I analyzed 652 surveys and did 48 interviews across these 3 regions. And in the spirit of the Mitchell Center, I formed stakeholder advisory committees to really help inform this process from the beginning of the project that included industry partners, farmers, policymakers, nonprofits, and researchers as well, both in California and in New Zealand. And that was a hugely important aspect of the process. And so I love that that's a lot of what the Mitchell Center does as well. And then you probably don't care as much about the methods, but for those of you that do, mostly through multiple mediation models and structural equation models and regression techniques. So this is what people always assume when I tell them I went to New Zealand to do research for 4 years. They were like, really? That must be hard. Oh, and you go to the wine grape growing regions too. This is really a hard, challenging project. And it is gorgeous. This is Mount Ropehu, which is on the North Island, which is where I actually lived for a year when I first moved to New Zealand before I started my PhD. And this is a sheep and beef farm that I've worked on before. But actually, there's a really good reason why I chose to work in California and New Zealand, and that is largely because of the policies that are in those two regions. So both places actually have climate change policies on the books, or were about to be on the books when I was doing my work. So New Zealand started an emissions trading scheme in 2008, and California had a cap and trade program in 2013. So they both had these policy options on the table or already being implemented that were proposing to involve agriculture in some way, either through reporting or otherwise. The other thing that's really important is that they're very different in terms of their subsidies. So New Zealand has no subsidies, 0 subsidies. They have gotten rid of farm subsidies in any form in the mid-'80s, and they haven't had them since. And obviously California is a slightly different story. So that's important to keep in mind as I report some of the results as well. And the other thing is that California's had this long history of environmental policies, and that comes to play as well down the future. But they're also heavily agricultural areas. New Zealand's greenhouse gas emissions, 48% of them are from agriculture. So agriculture was inherently going to be a part of any climate solution that they had. And in California, there are certain sectors, like the dairy sector especially, that was being targeted for some of its emission reduction potential. So not surprisingly, the policy in New Zealand was a little bit controversial. So when they first tried to implement this policy, they called it the fart tax. Flatulence, another ridiculous tax by Labor. Labor is the progressive, more equivalent to a Democratic Party here. And this was actually not even the emissions trading scheme. This was a research policy they were proposing, a levy on farmers in 2003 just to do research around mitigating greenhouse gas emissions from livestock in particular, since that's the biggest source of emissions. They have 40 million sheep, 4 million people, so there's a lot of methane floating around New Zealand. And so it's been controversial there for a long time, and the policies in California for farmers were also a challenge. So that context sort of gives you a sense of where farmers might have been when they started thinking about and talking about this with me. So the way I'm going to present some of the results of my work is to just start with a high-level introduction about some of the comparative results, and then I'll dig into a couple specific analyses and questions I was asking. So what are farmers' climate change perceptions? So across the 3 regions, we found really, really similar results, actually. So 51%, 53%, and 54% in California agreed overall, strongly or otherwise, that the global climate is changing. Fewer felt that global average temperatures are increasing. So again, really similar, 37, 38, 39%. We used the same questions in all 3 regions. And then on the last one was really about the role that human activities play in fossil fuel use as an important cause of climate change. And here we saw a little bit of a discrepancy with Marlborough, which comes back to that wine grape thing I talked about. So a lot of the responses in Marlborough were wine grape growers, because that's what a lot of the industry is there. The wine industry in New Zealand's been pretty much on the sustainability path for about the last decade, and 95% of their vineyards are certified sustainable. So they have a little bit of a different environmental ethos possibly there, which might attribute to that perspective. But in California, roughly a third of farmers think that humans are contributing to climate change. That's important when you talk about mitigating emissions versus adapting to climate change, because if you're not picturing humans as playing a role in that process, the conversation around mitigating emissions is more challenging than just talking about dealing with things like drought or floods, for example. So we also asked about some of their risk perceptions, and overall what we found was that there was general agreement across the regions that climate change poses risk to agriculture globally. That's true, and especially in New Zealand, less so in California, about 50%. So here the blue bars are the agreement and orange is disagreement. But also farmers think that there's opportunities for agriculture through climate change, and especially if you look at a place like Maine, where warming temperatures may not necessarily be such a bad thing for certain crops, it may be for others, but farmers were looking at both sides of this equation, not just one side of it. Now, when we started to drill down beyond that, so again, benefits equated with opportunities, so farmers are still sort of thinking there might be benefits and opportunities, but they disagree about the risks aspect at a local level. So far fewer of them thought agriculture would be risky to me in my region. It's risky to climate change and global agriculture, but less so for me and my place, which I'll come back to. We also found really striking results across what they were concerned about for the future. So I grouped these by economic and policy issues, water and temperature issues, and you see a pretty consistent trend here. And guess what? The most concerning thing for farmers in the future is more government regulations in all places. They're worried about being regulated on climate change issues, but they're also really worried about pests and diseases, which I think is something that doesn't get nearly as much conversation with farmers that could potentially be a really strong interest for them. And then we asked about the kinds of practices they'd be interested in adopting, both across adaptation and mitigation. So on the adaptation side, we found actually reducing their stocking rates could be a strategy that many of them would consider. So that would reduce methane emissions, but they're also interested in things like drought-tolerant crops. And not surprisingly, the farmers in California want to drill more wells, which they've been doing as a result of the drought. This data was collected in 2011, and that's exactly what we've seen happen out there. So not necessarily all of these things are good responses, but they're the kinds of responses that farmers themselves are considering when they think about how do they deal with these changes. And on the mitigation side, it was really about efficiency and alternative energies. So solar and wind were really interesting to farmers, increasing fertilizer use efficiency or farm equipment efficiency or reducing electricity on farm. It was some of these other strategies that were either with high capital costs or potential impacts on the farm, like reducing fertilizer rate versus increasing efficiency. The way that you think about how you frame that was really important in terms of what we saw farmers were interested in adopting. And I'll go into some of these a little bit more in detail. So generally, when you look across the three regions, we found that farmers have climate concerns, not overwhelmingly, but they are concerned about future risk issues in particular. And they actually seem to be somewhat interested in changing their behavior. So what actually influences that? And that's what I'm going to focus on for the rest of my talk. So the first question that we wanted to think about was how do global versus local perceptions and scale influence the willingness that farmers might have to change their behavior? And we drew upon a theory, this is my only theory slide, I promise, called psychological distance. And this is the idea that people perceive something, an issue, depending on how close or far away it is to them. And that's across 4 different realms. So spatially, so is it near or distant to me, so geographically. Temporally, is it near term or far term? And cognitively, is it concrete and observable or abstract? And then across behavior. So this idea of self-interest, mostly benefiting me, would have a low level of control versus this cooperative, high level control. And under this context, we wanted to think about, well, how might concern for local climate change issues versus global issues impact behaviors differently? And the idea being that local would be driving adaptation behaviors that are more near-term, close to the farm, and particularly concrete and observable, as opposed to global mitigation, which is more distant and far away. And so normally you might test for the psychological distance theory by looking at how an experience influences beliefs and that influences behaviors. And we were proposing to break this idea up a little bit. And so what we looked at instead was how experience with climate change would influence both local and global concerns, but that these local concerns would be driving this sort of near-term adaptation idea on your farm that's very concrete versus mitigation behaviors which are more global and abstract and more cooperative in nature. So we looked at this in California, and I'll walk you through this diagram. What we did was we looked at how farmers had perceived a change in local water availability and how that influenced their concern for future water issues locally versus global climate concerns, and then the influence that that had in this context on mitigation behaviors. And we also looked at it across adaptation behaviors. And what we found, the solid arrows here are the significance pathways. So if you look here, in both models, this idea that water had changed influenced both their local and their global concerns, but only the global concerns went on to influence their likelihood to adopt mitigation behaviors, whereas their concern for local climate impacts and changes influenced their likelihood to adopt adaptation behaviors. So we were able to demonstrate through this model in this particular place, at least, that there are these different cognitive pathways that people have about how they experience something locally versus globally, and how that might match with the kind of behavior that you would actually have them think about implementing at the farm level. Now, the important thing about this in California is that we asked them about water. So California has obviously been going through a drought for the last 4 years. It was happening at the beginning of the study. California water has been contentious for a long time. It's a highly political issue out there. So we started to think, is there just something going on here about the fact that we asked about water? So we also tested those same relationships and asked about temperature. And we didn't find the same effect. So there was something going on about water being this really important cognitive thing that was driving their concerns and then driving their potential behaviors. And that led us to really think about, so what if we tested this in a different place? Would we find that different factors influenced what farmers might do at the farm? And because I'm actually trained as an ecologist for my PhD, I started thinking about this like very basic ecological theory that I learned about in my first class, which is Liebig's law of the minimum. It's this old agricultural science turned ecological idea that a system is fundamentally limited in its growth by its most limiting factor. So the idea here, this barrel, it's water limited because water is the lowest piece of wood, and so therefore you can't put any more water in that barrel because water is the limiting factor. Well, in the context of people, I started thinking, so are there limiting factors within the farm system then that fundamentally affect what people might adopt in terms of adaptation strategies? So in California it's water, but in other regions maybe it's something different. So we looked at this in New Zealand as well, since we'd also gathered data there. And across the two regions, I was hypothesizing that there are probably 5 different things that really influence these limiting factors idea. And that's history, future changes, infrastructure, what's the dominant crop or livestock system, and the crop varieties in that region. Now, Hawke's Bay, as you can see here, even though they grow some grapes, they're mostly sheep and beef and horticulture down along the water. But most of the region is hill country like this. It's not irrigated in the sense that the sheep and beef farmers are not irrigated. They're rain-fed agriculture. They've had a history of droughts in that region that have influenced them. Whereas Marlborough is heavily irrigated, as I'll also show you in a minute. They have switched to most of their crop being grapes now, and they have a lot of water infrastructure. But they also are growing grapes, which are very temperature sensitive. And especially, have any of you ever had a New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc? I'm sure, like a few of us. My aunt literally drank some last night. Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc is the New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. It has this really distinctive flavor profile. If you've ever had it, it's unlike any other Sauvignon Blanc. And it is only in that region that produces this characteristic. And it is only that place that you can get this characteristic. And so if they can no longer grow Sauvignon Blanc in Marlborough, it ruins an entire nation's wine industry, essentially. So farmers there are really, and Sauvignon Blanc is very temperature sensitive. You know, within a couple of degrees, and it has a totally different profile, and you're growing red grapes there. You're no longer growing a white variety. So for these reasons, we were hypothesizing that water was going to be the limiting factor in Hawke's Bay, and Marlborough would be this limiting factor and temperature would be this limiting factor in Marlborough. So we ran the exact same experiment, exact same questions. We actually broadened it a little bit to ask not just about water experiences, but all kinds of experiences with climate. So temperature changes, water changes, extreme events, drought, etc. And then we tested this model across both of those places with either water or temperature concerns as the limiting factor. And what we found was that this was actually true in New Zealand. So we just published this paper in February in Agriculture, Ecosystems, and Environment. We were able to demonstrate that water was really this mediating factor between experience and potential to change behavior, whereas temperature was really this mediating experience in Marlborough between experience of climate and adaptation behaviors. Now, the reality is that different limiting factors happen in different places. So one of the things that I would encourage us to think about here is what might be the limiting factors on Maine farms. But perceptions also influence what people have experienced. So one thing that kept coming up was, well, are people actually able to really remember what they've experienced? Like, do they actually remember climate change? How far back can people think about this kind of thing? So in New Zealand, we asked farmers what they thought had happened. So what historical climate change they had experienced across our two regions for both summer temperatures, winter temperatures, and average annual rainfall. So what you'll see here is that a lot of farmers in Marlborough think that annual rainfall has increased, and a significant number in Hawke's Bay as well. Now, what we were trying to understand was, are these perceptions accurate? So I'm not a climate scientist, but luckily I met one at Harvard, and Nathan Mueller models crop yield changes under different climate scenarios. And so we actually used the downscale NIWA data from Marlborough and Hawke's Bay from 1980 to 2012 to look at how these perceptions actually track with reality. So here's what we found. So what this is showing is Marlborough, Hawke's Bay, annual precipitation on top, and then these are the months down the bottom. So this is December, January, February, which is summer there, just to reiterate. December, January, February, and then June, July, and August. And actually what we found was that annual precipitation has not changed at all across either region. So let me explain this a little bit further. If this bar crosses over zero, it's not significant. So anything that's to the left or to right of this dotted line is considered significant. Otherwise, there's been no statistically significant change. So we didn't find that annual rainfall had increased in either region. In fact, what we found was that only could we say that winter temperatures had increased in both places. But despite that, we had a really large percent of farmers who thought, especially in Marlborough, annual rainfall has increased. 51% of farmers said it's gone up. And we also had a pretty significant minority and a majority in Marlborough say summer temperatures have gone down. Not increased, they've gone down. So the hypothesis here was that the infrastructure in these regions has actually potentially changed the way that people think about climate change, and in particular, irrigation infrastructure. So in our communities, we use a lot of different kinds of infrastructure to control for weather and to control for climate. And they could be dams, they could be gullies, they could be irrigation. But this infrastructure is in our everyday lives, and we don't actually talk about it very much in terms of the way people think about their weather and their climate. So we wanted to look at whether the increase in irrigation that we had seen in these regions was potentially influencing how they were perceiving climate change. So this graph shows the increase in irrigation across Marlborough and Hawke's Bay from the time frame in which we looked at these data change, so 1980 to 2012. And there's been a massive increase in, to give you a sense, these little dots, this is the total percent of cropland area that could be irrigated. So in Marlborough, they're basically irrigating almost everything. And in Hawke's Bay, it's a little bit less, as I said, because of that sheep and beef hill country mindset. But the irrigation in both of these places has gone up significantly in the last 30 years and could potentially be influencing why 54% of farmers thought annual rainfall had increased. They have more water available. They're able to control it better. So what we found was that actually, sheep and beef farmers who don't have irrigation had an overall lower mean perception that annual rainfall had changed compared to farmers that have irrigation, lending support to that hypothesis. We also looked at this idea of an irrigation cooling effect. So the literature demonstrates that when you have a lot of irrigation in one place, it can actually potentially lower the temperature within that area because there's a lot of water around in certain contexts. So what we found was that summer temperature and annual rainfall were actually negatively correlated, which meant that farmers who thought that annual rainfall had increased were also more likely to think that summer temperatures had decreased, also suggesting that they might be experiencing a summer cooling effect from irrigation. And importantly, in terms of what does this all matter, well, these perceptions were correlated with greater climate change belief and also future concerns, whether or not the perceptions were accurate. So farmers who thought that summer temperatures had gone up, even though they haven't, were more likely to believe in climate change, whether or not those perceptions were necessarily accurate to their region, which lends some conversation around this idea of motivated reasoning, that people are experiencing or think they're experiencing things even though they may be not, and that's driving some of their belief. But I think it also brings up a really interesting conversation around scale, and how do people experience something and how might that scale influence their beliefs. So if you're a farmer and you are actually experiencing an irrigation cooling effect, well, you might think summer temperatures are decreasing on your farm, and you might not necessarily be inaccurate per se. But at the regional level, that's not necessarily happening. And at the global level, average global temperatures are increasing. So when we think about how do we talk about climate change, it's also important to think about how do people perceive this scale, and at what scale are they thinking about this issue and the way that they're perceiving it. So putting it all together, the last study that we looked at on this behavior change aspect was intention to do something versus actual change. And that's huge because a lot of academic studies really think about intention. We ask, I'm to blame. This is all my work and most of it's about intention. What are you likely to do in the future? What do you think you might do? Well, I thought I was going to go running this weekend when I was up at my family's cabin, and I never went running once. I had the intention to go running. I'm sure we all have the intention to do things, but we don't necessarily do them. So looking at these differences between intention to do something versus actual behavior change is really important in the social psychology literature. So what we found, and I showed you this data earlier, this is from New Zealand. Lots of people said they'd be likely to do something. I would like to install solar panels or wind turbines. I would like to build water storage facilities. But the people who'd actually done something was much smaller, of course. So there was this big difference between farmers who said they were going to do something versus farmers who had already done something. And pretty big discrepancies here on some of these things. Some of them are higher than others, but a lot of people said they wanted to look at biofuels, and basically no one is doing it. So the important question there is, well, is there a difference then between what drives people to say they're going to do something versus what actually people did? So we looked at this using a theory called the theory of planned behavior, which is a social psychology theory. And here's what we found. We found no association between intended and actual behaviors. So people who had said they were intended to do something were not more likely to have actually done something, and actually vice versa. People who had already done something weren't necessarily more likely to say they would intend to do other things in the future. So there's a disconnect fundamentally, in our work at least, between this intention and this actual behavior. Now that's fairly consistent with this theory because they often say that there's this motivation that's needed to actually implement behavior. But the other thing that was really interesting was that belief in climate change was only positively associated with intention to do something as opposed to actual adoption. So this farmers who were more likely to believe in something said they would intend to do something in the future, but the people who maybe already adopted some of these practices probably haven't done so for climate change reasons, is largely what we concluded there. Lots of people then would say, well, it's all about money, right? Profit and money is what drives people to change behavior. We actually found that profit motivations was only present in 1 out of our 4 models, so it actually wasn't a major driver of intention or actual adoption. Biggest thing was perceived capacity. The idea that farmers felt they actually had the ability to change their behavior, and they had the skills and the technical assistance and all of these other things to do it, they were the ones who said, I can do it. And so that to me is hugely important, because then you talk about how do you empower farmers? How do you get farmers to feel that they have the capacity to change? And that is hugely important, I think, in this climate change discussion. So the last little blurb I'll give you about is on the policy front. So I wanted to bring this up because we had this really great quote in our California work. And this farmer said to us, "We can adapt to the environmental impacts of climate change. I'm not sure we can adapt to the legislature." And maybe in Maine, this might be a quote you would also hear, potentially. I think it's probably true across every state in the country. In California, as I mentioned, they've dealt with a lot of environmental regulations over the past years, and we kept hearing from farmers, well, it's the government that's taking my water, it's not climate change. And we wanted to actually look at this. So my thinking was, well, limiting factors don't always have to be biophysical. A farmer could feel limited by something other than a biophysical limit, and it could be a policy limitation. And so we asked farmers, would you participate in a government incentive program for climate change mitigation or adaptation? And this is across all three areas, but I'm just going to focus the model results on California. And here you can see that roughly about 48% of farmers said they would in California, fewer in New Zealand actually, which could in part do with the fact they don't have incentive programs there. There are no government subsidies, no programs. But this one is interesting. So government regulations will make it more difficult to adapt to the risks posed by climate change. And here you see a big difference between California and New Zealand. A huge more number of farmers really agreed with this statement. They really thought it was government regulations that were going to make it hard for them to deal with climate change. So to look at this in the context of policy experiences, remember this framework I brought up earlier, so we looked at how climate experiences influence these local versus global beliefs. And instead of looking at adoption of practices, we wanted to see how that influenced their concern for or ability to support climate policies. But with one careful change. We also added in their previous policy experiences. So not just their experience with climate change, but also their experience with 4 other government policies. And I have an added slide at the end if anyone wants to know what those are. And these were policies, some of which were 25 years old. They'd been dealing with them for a really long time. And what we found was that it was their previous policy experiences that had a larger impact on their climate change belief and their interest in response to climate policies than actual climate change. So it was their policy experiences that were driving their potential concern and belief in climate change, not their experience with climate change per se. All, of course, because they were worried about potential regulations. So I'll just conclude with telling you a little bit about some recent extensions on this work, and then a couple of what I think are solution-oriented ideas for how you can think about this work in context. My more recent work has actually been expanding into the developing world and looking at how developing world farmers may perceive and respond to climate change differently than those in the developed world, obviously incredibly different contexts. And a lot of this work is around food security in particular. So this work is across 15 countries in Latin America, East and West Africa, and South Asia. And this is with the CGIR, the International Consultative Group for International Agricultural Research. They have a climate change, agriculture, and food security program. And they, thankfully not me, collected 5,400 household level surveys from farmers across these 15 countries. And then they have very graciously given me access to that data. So I've been helping them analyze that and working with people in country to understand this. So I'll just give you a little snippet of this because I think it's an interesting extension. But what we found was that overall, majority of farmers have faced a climate crisis in these places in the last 5 years, and the majority of those didn't receive assistance. So here overall is the global numbers. 71% of these farmers globally experienced a climate shock, which if you think back to my results from New Zealand and the US, is much higher. And there's some regional variations here, but overall, most of the farmers that get this, that have a climate shock don't receive assistance. And these are subsistence level smallholder farmers for the most part. This has an impact on their food security. So we found that overall those that faced a climate crisis were 63% more likely to be food insecure throughout the year. So they're facing a climate crisis. they're not necessarily getting assistance, and if they face that climate crisis, they're hungry, more hungry than those who didn't throughout the year. And this is consistent everywhere except in Latin America. And then finally, the more recent thing that we're working on is looking at whether these changes, and trying to apply the limiting factors work here. What we found in these regions, this is in Uganda, Senegal, and Kenya, a huge number of farmers think they've experienced climate change in their lifetime. 99.4% versus, 54% in California. And that could be in part because these are really vulnerable people. I mean, they are completely exposed. They do not have a safety net. And what I'm trying to look at, in the future is whether the limiting factors idea might also apply here in the developing world. And so if we can apply working with some ecologists to try to look at some actual ecological data around the extent of these shocks and how that might downscale into these villages, and whether they're water events that they're experiencing or temperature events, and how that might influence their potential to change behaviors in the future. So I like to keep my concluding slides short and sweet. This is Lake Taupo in the North Island of New Zealand, where they've implemented a cap and trade program for nitrogen, actually the first one in the world, which is pretty interesting. But to really think about some of the implications of this work and how it might be useful or interesting, or how you might apply it in reality, personal experiences is what's driving a lot of people's attitudes and beliefs. So the idea that we can just continue to publish scientific papers and expect people to read them and change their behavior, I think probably the Mitchell Center gets that, but some people haven't quite picked up on that yet. And so understanding how you can take your phenomenon, whether it's climate change or another issue, and making it personally relevant to someone can actually be hugely important in influencing the way they think about the problem. Communicating to scale, this idea that global and mitigation behaviors versus local and adaptation behaviors could be really important as you think about framing the context of the conversation with farmers and agricultural community. If there's two things I can leave here today by telling you, this is one of them. Engagement is crucial. The idea that 25 years after a policy had been implemented, it was still driving the way that farmers thought about a current environmental issue is huge. And I think if we can't engage with the agricultural community now, there are going to be other issues in the future that we'll continue to not be able to engage with them on because they haven't felt part of the process. So I really commend the Mitchell Center for engaging with stakeholders because it's hugely important in the way that people think about problems. Infrastructure can't be ignored, so in some ways it can be both an adaptation benefit, but also a potential challenge. And we haven't really talked about the role of infrastructure in agriculture in terms of how it influences the perceptions people have. So if the farmers in New Zealand think that they have more rainfall, that's fine so long as there's more water for them. But it turns out Marlborough has over-allocated its water resources. And these farmers that have historically gotten this water that they think will continue to be there may not be there. So just thinking about what infrastructure is in place and might that change in the future, and might that be influencing how farmers are thinking about what they're experiencing or what they may experience, I think is really important. This is the second one that I like to leave you with, is empowerment. How can we as professors, students, the academic community help to empower people to feel that they can change their behavior? How can we help them have the technical resources or the social support or sometimes financial resources, but not always? What can we do to help people feel that they can actually change as opposed to feeling helpless? And some of that's around positive messaging. Negative messages don't usually work, so doom and gloom often makes people feel powerless as opposed to empowered. So thinking about how do we as universities frame the problem, frame the solutions, if we can do it in an empowering way as opposed to an overwhelming way, that can be really important. And then finally, this idea of limiting factors. And I'd really love to explore this in New England. I've looked at it in California, New Zealand. Every place is different. The ecology is different. The culture is different. The context is different. What we experience here from climate change may be different as well. And I'd love to think about how to apply some of that work here in Maine as well. So thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to come, and time for questions, definitely. So look forward to them. Thank you.
Yeah, in terms of perceptions, I wonder what role local media, newspapers, talk radio, we took a liberal from the north who wasn't directly involved in climate change. They sold used cars or something.
Mm-hmm.
They moved to rural Texas, and they bombarded constantly with conversation and media denying that climate is changing. Would there, they didn't have a strong, influence or interest in it. Would it start to shift to a different position?
Yeah, so there's a large body of work out there that looks at the broader public perceptions of climate change. Anthony Lyserowitz at Yale University is one of the big guys that does this. He does a survey every year, and there was a great paper that came out a couple years ago that looked at what are the big factors that actually change these perceptions over time, and media was one of them. So media perceptions, but actually the biggest one is politics. So media report on politics, of course, but it was negative conversations from conservatives had a huge influence, as well as positive conversations from Democrats. So media plays a role, and it's not, also disclaimer, it is not scientific articles. That was like one of the things that did not influence climate change perceptions. So there's some economic stuff, like when the GDP is doing good, people start to care about the environment again. So there's some aspect there that we just can't necessarily influence, but it was popular media. So it was New York Times coverage of things that influenced these perceptions. But that's a good one in terms of how perceptions can change over time. The good news is Sid Miller believes in climate change now, so if you move to Texas, you may actually, that may be countered. But yeah, I think this is a hugely important thing for scientists to understand and for us to engage in. I do media interviews with NPR and talk radio, and I've talked about my work, and I think that making sure that we're conversing in the mediums in which people listen to is important. Because that is what influences a lot of people's perceptions. Yeah.
But we can't take everybody to China, right?
No.
And I thought, with Inconvenient Truth, I thought, well, Hal did a beautiful job of trying to engage us, but then people look at it like, oh, that's just liberal whitewashing. They're just sort of picking the data or picking the images to try to influence me. So Inconvenient Truth didn't have the leverage that I had hoped when it came out. So what do you think can be done then?
Well,
to help influence those?
Yeah. So this is where I think the local thing is really important. I think if you actually look at the data on climate belief following an Inconvenient Truth, it did go up, and then it promptly skyrocketed because it became a political issue. Because people believed it initially, and then politicians framed it in different contexts. And then, of course, he personally received a lot of criticism about his own lifestyle and things like that. He actually gave a talk at UVM 2 weeks ago, and it was surprisingly really good. So he's still giving that message, but I actually think this is the role that places like University of Maine, Cooperative Extension play. I think a lot of the work about how might climate change really look here is super important, because seeing a flood in China or looking at smog in China, I actually think half the reason Sid Miller maybe said that China is where he thought climate change was happening was because now he can say, well, China should do something about it, right? So, I think I really, really believe that this is a local issue. I think we can appeal to some of these global goodwill ideas and this idea that, yeah, people in Africa are going to really get hurt by climate change, and food security is going to be a terrible problem. But if we're talking about local challenges and local experiences, that has to come from local people, and especially from people within their own communities who maybe experience some of these things. Our biggest advocate on our project in California was a farmer who was on our stakeholder advisory committee, who basically had said, this is a problem and I'm going to do something on my farm about it. And he was a leader in the community that everyone respected. And when Tony Turkovich stood up and said, this is an issue and here's what I'm doing on my farm, people listened. So finding local champions and local leaders, I think, is hugely important to tell a more localized personal story and to help people start to see that maybe what they are experiencing is a part of a broader phenomenon, but bringing it to a place that they can experience tangibly themselves. That would be my advice on that.
So at several places in your presentation, you showed results that indicated that people had a somewhat of a distrust for government, and they were more concerned, I think you said at one point, with regulation than climate change.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if the people that were interviewed were informed about some of the accomplishments of regulation. I think about the effect of the Clean Water Act on the conditions in the Androscoggin River in the early 1970s. And then more recently, the Chesapeake Bay program started in the early 1980s as a volunteer. States were going to come to the table, and it lasted for several decades. And only in the last 10 years they said this isn't working, and now they have a regulatory approach to implementing a lot of the strategies. So there's a reversal of some of this, and I'm wondering if the people that are interviewed for these have some, even a chart showing implementation of the legislation and what the effect is in terms of a cause.
Yeah, let
and
me
effect.
show you this supplementary slide because it digs into this a little bit more. So these were the 4 policies that we asked about: pesticide use reporting, which started in 1990, rice straw burning, so basically the idea they could no longer burn it, water quality waivers, and then diesel engine emissions. And if you look at these were the 4 different things that we asked them to evaluate these policies about over time. And you definitely see that there are some potential shifts the older the policy is. So, for example, under pesticide use reporting, we had a majority of farmers said that they thought that policy balanced the interests of the public and farmers, that it improved the environment, that, they also thought it was time consuming. But we did notice there was sort of this trend, right? So the idea that the older a policy was and the longer they'd potentially been around it and seen some of the potential benefits, that it was starting to, in their mind at least, be a little bit less onerous. I'll tell you, when we did these interviews in 2011 in California, and I've done some more recent ones as well, everybody wanted to talk about diesel engine emission regulations. Which, fair enough. I mean, some of these farmers were going to have to buy entirely new tractors because of this policy, like $50,000, $75,000. And they, which is why you can see, it's too costly. That's the green bar there. So we did definitely see that over time there was potentially this lag effect of seeing the potential benefit of the policy. But I tell you, it's also about the process. I mean, the regulations, the rice straw burning is a really good one actually. That was one where they got together with the rice growers from the beginning to talk about how to implement the policy. And that one in general was perceived to be more positive, and that's kind of a success story in some of the California policy environment. But I think in general there was this idea there that, gosh, just another regulation, another thing that we have to think about. And I think farmers want to help improve their environment, but I just think it would go a long way if they felt that they were at the table. Even if they knew they still had to deal with the regulation, if they felt like they were at the table. So I agree with a lot of what you're saying. I think there's this lag effect, but I think there's still a huge opportunity moving forward to make sure that they're involved in the process.
Yeah. So I'm assuming that these are all conventional farmers that you spoke with?
Nope.
Okay, then
Yeah.
Was there a difference between conventional farmers and organic farmers in any of their perceptions?
Yep, there were. So this study in both regions was across all type of, I might have this data actually. Let's see. These are the top crops. Nope, okay, I didn't put it in there. We asked across all types of farms, all types of agriculture, including organic and conventional growers. We interviewed some organic growers, we interviewed some conventional growers, and then we had 652 surveys. So in general, I think that we only had about 7 to 8% that were organic, which is pretty consistent with averages. And organic growers are much more likely to believe in climate change, and they're much more likely to think that it's human caused. And on some of the practices that are more conducive to organic farming, they were more likely to want to implement those. But we did find this sort of greater environmental ethos perspective in the organic growers.
And it's just one follow-up
Sure,
question.
yeah.
Was there any difference in perception in different range of farm size?
No. We didn't find across the, oh, I should mention in all of those models that I showed you with the bubbles, we controlled for farm size, age of the farmer, organic status. Sorry, I should have said this before. We controlled for all of these demographic and farm characteristics. And this is actually pretty consistent with some of the literature. There's a great researcher at Purdue University, Linda Procopi, who's done a lot of work around adoption of agricultural best management practices, and she did a really great review 2 years ago that demonstrated that across 70 different studies looking at the adoption of these best management practices, there was no consistent demographic or farm size effect which I actually think is a good thing, because I think it demonstrates that all kinds of farmers could be open to changing, and that we shouldn't just target towards big farms or small farms or organic farms. So we controlled for all of those things in our studies. So the effects that I showed here was above and beyond any of those effects, but we didn't find a consistent farm size effect actually. But there was an organic effect.
So I think we're coming up at 4 o'clock. I apologize, but I know some people have to leave. And if you have questions you haven't been able to ask yet, I'd encourage you to come on up, and let's thank Meredith